Earlier, I gave our viewers your general biography. Could you tell us more about your combat experience and how did you end up in the special military operation?
I ended up in the special military operation as a volunteer. I have some health issues, which is why I wasn't drafted initially. Let's start with that, right? At the outset of the war, when Vladimir Vladimirovich announced the beginning of the operation, I, of course, tried to enlist right away, but I couldn't. There were too many people. The operation seemed to be going well, everything was fine. It wasn't until August 2022 that I was able to join the assault unit of the 70th Regiment of the 42nd Division. That's our famous and mighty 58th Army. I immediately went to a training camp near Donetsk. After 2 weeks, I received my first combat mission as part of the assault unit. It was generally known as Kerch, but at that time it was just called Storm. Storm is any assault unit in the Russian army.
Did you have any military combat experience before this?
No, how should I put it? It was more like guerrilla training, so it was military patriotic training, just self-education, you could say. There was nothing more than that. I ended up in a unit where most of the guys were just like me. We were all self-trained, bought mock weapons, gear, and just went out and trained on our own.
So you ended up in Donbass in 2022?
Yeah, about 2 weeks before the mobilization started.
Can you describe your first battle? How did it go?
The first battle, we received our first assault mission, and as fresh recruits, we were all relatively new to the field, having just completed a month of training. Mobilization had recently concluded, and the more experienced soldiers had already been deployed to their positions a week ahead of us. They were also just as shocked and scared, with numerous bad rumors circulating about the situation in the army and on the front lines. Despite all this, we maintained a surprisingly upbeat spirit. Initially, our rallying cry was a profanity aimed at the enemy, specifically directed at the Ukrainians. I'll leave it to your imagination to infer what we wished to do to them. We were having fun, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the situation. For us, it was like, wow, we get to shoot this weapon and we get to shoot that one. It felt like a vacation in a way. We trained and had fun. Our first mission was an assault operation. We were supposed to cover a group of scouts, then move in and attack the enemy's position ourselves. We would come from one side of a forest strip, and the scouts would come from the other side. Our job was to cover them, and then we'd attack from the flank. The scouts were experienced, so we couldn't go first. That was the only reason. The command thought, wow, all these young guys. Most of us were about 18 or 19 years old. Things went sideways pretty quickly. The scouts were spotted immediately, and the enemy started unleashing heavy fire. We returned fire and managed to hit a bunker with a grenade launcher. After that, we spent the rest of the day pulling back the wounded. One of our comrades, who had been fighting since the onset of the war, suffered severe leg injuries. My buddy and I spent the remainder of the day dragging 3 injured soldiers to safety, and one of them required extensive assistance due to his inability to walk. So that was my first combat mission. It ended up being more of a medical or humanitarian effort. But my buddy is fine now. He's capable of running already.
Well, that's good. But this begs the question. Many people, both in Russia and the West, up until 2022, perceived the Ukrainian army as weak, incompetent. As someone who saw the enemy in 2022, please explain what was wrong with these predictions that the Ukrainians would quickly collapse in a war?
I think, if you think about it, it was really good intelligence work by the Western special services to keep everything secret, preparing the Ukrainians little by little. There were news reports that Ukrainians were coming, they were coming there to train, that NATO officers were coming to train Ukrainians, they were participating in joint exercises somewhere. All of this was happening. Then, at the beginning of 2022, when the battle for Mariupol was just starting, we already saw Western grenade launchers and all that. It seems to me that it was just a very good special operation to confuse our military experts. And in Russia, before 2022, there weren't many mechanisms for outsiders to come in and offer advice. There was a bit of rigidity. It all went down this way. And the Ukrainians, yes, they were trained, or rather they were trained very well. We could see how they moved in a Western way according to all those manuals. Now they've begun developing their own approach to warfare. But back then they advanced and retreated and performed maneuvers with light armored vehicles in line with NATO standards.
But even in 2022, a couple of months after the start of the special military operation, did you already see signs that the Ukrainians really knew the NATO military approach well and were actively using it?
Yes, but for example, in the training camp, they tried to convince us that guys, don't be afraid to shoot at them. The Ukrainians are scared of shooting. Supposedly, they're only good at dropping bombs with drones and artillery and then running away. They were trying to convince us that we shouldn't be afraid to go after them. But then, as it turned out, no one is actually afraid of shootouts. Everything is fine. They shoot just fine. And they're actually very good at advancing and using various tactical techniques well. Before, we had this idea after the first battle, Ukrainian special forces fought well against us, but their mobilized troops are definitely losers.
Really?
Yeah, and then afterwards we said, damn, these guys are pretty decent after all. What can you do? Turns out we're on equal footing, huh? Well, damn, that's bad.
But, I mean, you said they were well-versed in Western military doctrines, but does anything Soviet remain in the Ukrainian army in terms of military approach? After all, many of these generals like Syrskyi, Zaluzhny, they are still people from the Soviet school. So I assume they know the Russian military doctrine better than any other opponent and know how we like to fight.
Yes, that's why Ukraine is like Chechnya. In Chechnya, there were also former police officers, former Afghanistan war veterans, Chechens who later became militants. And it's the same here. They know very well how we will act. At least they knew how we would act in the beginning. That's why they could resist us. As for what's left from the Soviet days, I don't know. Probably that they really like to set up strong points in the same manner as us. Because if you read, for example, American textbooks on how to set up strong points and compare them with ours, it's two completely different schools. The Ukrainians, they do everything according to the standards of the Soviet school. That's why our strong points, well, they're the same. They match up well. And they probably really like it when APCs work alongside infantry because, for example, the American Bradley has more convenient armor than our BMP-3 because the BMP-3 is smaller. For example, I have a hard time fitting inside with gear on, but in a Bradley you can stand comfortably at full height. And I was stood inside a burned Bradley. It's quite comfortable.
You stood in a Bradley?
Yeah, in a burned one.
We'll get back to this once you talk about the burnt Bradley.